All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Inspirational Interviews here in the Yoga and More group. Today, I have with me one of my yoga teacher trainers, Libby Hinsley. Hi, Libby.
Hi.
So glad to have you here. And Libby's passion is anatomy, and she's also a physical therapist, and has so much experience to bring to us as yogis and just humans moving in our lives. So I'm going to just read a little bit of her bio to give you all a little introduction, and then we'll launch into a conversation. So Libby Hinsley is a physical therapist and a certified yoga therapist. She has been teaching yoga for 15 years and training yoga teachers for 10 years. So I must have been right at the beginning of when I was first in yoga teacher training, right when you first started.
Yeah.
And practicing physical therapy for 8 years. After experiencing many years of chronic injury and pain related to her yoga practice, she found a way to practice that supported her body, mind, and spirit. It was life-changing. Libby now has a private PT practice where she integrates yoga and manual therapy and is launching an amazing online platform for yoga teachers to learn more about anatomy. So welcome to Inspirational Interviews, Libby.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I'd like to begin just by getting a little bit of the framework of your background with yoga. And I know you studied Vini yoga. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to that lineage?
Sure. So I started out yoga in college, and all there was at that time was Iyengar yoga. And so I thought that was cool. And then I got really into Ashtanga yoga, and I've been into a bunch of different yogas. But then I found this lineage. We could call it Vini yoga lineage, or we could call it the tradition of Desikachar and Krishnamacharya. And because Vini yoga is also a brand of yoga, so it kind of gets complicated.
Right.
But we could call it the Vini yoga lineage. And I found that in 2008, and really it was a little bit by accident. So in my teacher training program that I did in 2004, we read some books by Desikachar, and I thought they were great books. And then my friend from teacher training, she and I wanted to travel to India. And so we wanted to study yoga, of course, in India. So we went to Desikachar's place. And honestly, I had no idea what we were getting into, but it was an immersion, a month-long immersion in the tradition of Desikachar. And so at first, I have to tell you that I hated it. It was just so boring to me at that time. I was coming out of like a power yoga kind of habit. And this was something very, very different. So for the first week, I really struggled. And then it was like magic, and I fell in love with it. So it took me a while to come around to it. I mean, the last 3 weeks of that training, I loved it. I wanted to stay forever. I never wanted to leave. And something about the pace of it. So there's a slow motion pace. The tradition is very breath centric, and that is in contrast to a form centric approach to practice. So it's very much the breath is primary and the movement is secondary, and the breath creates movement in the body. So it's a very breath centric, and the movement just matches the breath. It's very slow. And that was really hard for me, physically hard, but also mentally hard, because I had I couldn't escape my experience. It was just like, I'm just stuck here. And so that tends to be uncomfortable, but it changed everything for me, actually, that experience.
Awesome. Yeah. So how did you come to be interested in digging deeper into anatomy after studying yoga for so many years?
Yeah. So I was teaching yoga for several years before it ever occurred to me that I might want to go be a PT. And in fact, I have to tell this little story. I was teaching a prenatal yoga class, and your sister was in it. Right. And she was like, my husband's a PT. You should go meet him. And then, of course, he became like my mentor and my employer later. And wonderful. Love your whole family. But so it was through kind of teaching yoga and having these experiences, both with my own body and also my students. After class, everyone wants to ask you their quick question about their injury or their shoulder pain or whatever. And I had no idea, of course, how to answer those questions. But I was curious, and I kind of wanted to learn more about that. And so that all just led me in that direction. In addition to just having had years of chronic yoga injuries, just aches and pains and chronic little nagging things that yoga would always make worse. And I was interested in getting to the bottom of that stuff, And so all of that led me just love studying anatomy. I just loved it. And I had never studied it before.
Mm-hmm. So what was your introduction to that? How did you dive in?
Well, I took, some yoga workshops, and there was one in particular I took many years ago with Paul Grilly, and it was an anatomy kind of workshop and a yin yoga workshop. And but the anatomy part really spoke to me, and he talked about this concept of anatomical variation among humans. And it's something I had never heard of. No one would ever know that our bodies are quite different, because there's this myth of a normal body that, right, that like it's all put together in the same way and the bones are shaped the same. And he really had this revolutionary presentation, I thought, that looked at bone shape, even just that, and how variable the shapes of our bones are. And that matters for what movements are available to us, how much movement, so I got really intrigued by that concept. And I remember him saying in that workshop, he said, this is actually just basic anatomy. Any PT would learn this. Any orthopedist would learn this. And I was like, that's it. I got to go to PT school, So that was really how I dove in. And then I had to take a couple years of prerequisites, but it was really once I got to PT school and learning the anatomy and the dissection, the cadaver lab and the functional anatomy. It was just obviously very heavy on anatomy and biomechanics. And I loved that part.
Awesome. Yeah. So cool. So enlighten us to what are some of the misconceptions that you see in what's happening in the yoga world? Where
should we begin?
Yeah. Give us lots of examples. We need to know.
So anatomy and yoga, gosh, there's so much to say about it. It's a really important topic for yoga teachers, especially, and also for practitioners who are trying to learn about their body too. And who want their teacher to know about anatomy, right? Like all my students used to think I know about anatomy after class, asked me about their hip pain. And I was like, I have no idea. That sounds interesting. So I think that it's important for yoga teachers to have a really basic understanding of anatomy, because they're guiding people through asana practice. We're using our bodies. And what I see in yoga teachers a lot is this misconception that movement is unsafe. Basically, I guess we can start there, that there's a little bit of an idea that we have to be very, very careful about movement. Otherwise, we're going to get injured, And I think that we have to kind of describe, well, what kind of yoga practice are we doing? Is it kind of basic, beginner friendly stuff, or is it super crazy advanced postures? So, well, that's different, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm kind of talking about your basic postures, your basic movements. I think there's a real misconception that it's very critical that you do it correctly, and that there is one correct way to do it anatomically, because that's just not true in my view, because of anatomical variation, and also because human movement is not inherently unsafe, and the human body is extremely resilient and it's designed for movement. So we're put together in a way that we're made to move. And certainly if we have some underlying injuries or, certain specific situations, that may change things, but in general, movement's a safe thing to do. So that's kind of the starting point. There's a lot of safety concern about, if your knee goes past your ankle, crazy things are going to happen, say in Warrior 2. There's all this very frenzy about, don't let your knee go past your ankle, stuff like that. That's really not that big of a deal. Sometimes things are a big deal, but most of those verbal anatomy cues, if once we unpack them, we'll see, that's not scary or unsafe. If it's uncomfortable, we'll change it and we'll move to a different position, that kind of thing. So that's really the biggest one, the idea that there's one correct way. So I'll tell you, I treat in my practice yoga people a lot. A bulk of my patients are either yoga teachers or the yoga practitioners. And I see more injuries arise in people who have been trying to do it correctly, whatever it is. They've been doing it the way they were taught as the correct way, especially people coming out of alignment-based systems. Those are the people I see injured, honestly, more often than not, because they've been trying to do it correctly, but it turns out the way they might have been doing certain postures wasn't actually correct for them. So we have to get more specific about the practitioner when we assign correctness. It's not a global correctness. It's like a specific practitioner correctness.
Right.
Yeah.
I had one of my former yoga teachers, like one of my first yoga teachers on here for an interview a few weeks ago. And she was talking about creating your own home practice and how there's this fear around like, well, what if you do the poses wrong? And that ultimately we need to like come into the awareness of like, well, does this feel good? Like, does this feel supportive in my body? Even if your body doesn't look like somebody else doing the same pose. And I loved that. And I feel like right now, especially teaching yoga online, you know, hundreds of people are watching my videos and I can't see them. And so in some ways it's this trust that like, it's been a great freeing, I would say, as a yoga teacher to just be like, everybody's got to be accountable for themselves. They're not waiting for me to walk around the room and be like, how does that feel? Like that looks uncomfortable, or like try moving your arm up 2 inches or whatever it is. And that ultimately that inner guidance is what we're all seeking, to have that awareness of like, is this supportive for me or detrimental right now?
Exactly. And that doesn't happen overnight. And that's where it gets tricky, because we do need a starting point. We really do. We need some description of what is this general shape like? What does this basically look like? And then we want to learn to approximate that shape in our own bodies in a way that feels supportive and doesn't cause ill effect. And so the starting point is very important. And that's usually what happens is we get so attached to the starting point that we forget that the starting point is actually just a reference. And we ought to be able to modify that to suit the practitioner. And a story that I like to tell from my time at Desikachar's place is I was there for a month with all basically Western students who had all basically come out of the same yogic background, and which is mostly alignment-based stuff, because Iyengar was pretty much yoga for so long in this country, synonymous. So, you know, people would ask questions to the teachers there about specific, you know, where's the big toe supposed to be in this pose, you know? And the teachers there would just look very confused, like they didn't understand the question. They were like, what are you talking about? It doesn't matter where your big toe is. You know, I mean, I'm using that as a silly example, but they were like, listen, the reason that we're teaching you the form, like that Krishnamacharya taught, the form of the posture is so you know basically what this shape is, and you know the starting point, and it's a reference. So you know what to approximate, but the whole point is that you modify it for the practitioner, whoever's practicing. So, you know, I love that concept because it gives so much freedom for people to find their way into movement and into posture in a way that is unique for them. And it's okay if it looks a little different. And there are very few instances where specific alignment really is important for safety. I would say there may be a couple, but they're very few, you know. But the problem is, as a teacher, that when you're saying to your students, notice how this feels, we don't have a lot of practice as people in noticing how things feel. And we need to be guided. Because if I just say to a group of people, you know, if there's discomfort, you know, move away from this or whatever, they may not actually know. Because it's actually really hard to go inside and inquire and notice the subtlety of inner experience. And that just takes practice. But that's ultimately where we got to go with it. So then we have our internal reference, and then we get really reliable information from our own experience. But as a starting yoga student, we need some guidance. We just need the teacher not to be so hung up on correctness that we lose sight of the freedom to modify.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. So, are there particular anatomical parts of the body that you see more issues with than others in the yoga community?
Yeah. I've had them all.
Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah. So the biggest one I probably see is sacroiliac joint pain, where the sacrum meets the ilium. Let me grab my pelvis real quick.
Okay. Your friend, the pelvis.
My friend, the pelvis. Here's a pelvis, just so handy. So here it is. Here's the back of the pelvis, and here's the ilium. Here's another ilium, and here's the sacrum. And so where those come together is the sacroiliac joint. You can really see it better from the front there. And there's not a lot of movement that happens there, but there's some. And the sacrum tends to get all wonky for yogis, and people have a lot of that low back kind of sacrum pain. That's probably the most common one I see. And then I see a lot of high hamstring strains up at the ischial tuberosity at the sitting bone, that chronic little tug there, that hamstring pain. And then I see a lot of shoulder injuries and hip pain. Anterior hip pain and anterior knee pain. Anyway, so all of those things are, not life-threatening, but they are nagging, especially that low back stuff. And people often have that who have hypermobility, and a ton of yogis have hypermobility. They're very bendy and very flexible and can do crazy things in their body. And that is who gets injured in yoga.
Yeah.
Someone who's really tightly put together, they're probably going to be fine, Really, they're not going to have as much trouble. People used to tell me all the time, I can't do yoga. I'm so inflexible. I can't even touch my toes. I'm like, that's awesome. You're going to be great, because you're probably not going to get injured. And I don't have to worry about you, because your body's going to give you limits that will keep you safe. But someone who's very mobile, they don't get those limits. And so they have to learn how to establish those. And when they get these injuries that are so common, their common sort of guess as to what's going on is that they're doing it incorrectly. They just need to get the alignment better, and then their sacrum will be fixed, and that's usually not the case.
Yeah. So learning to hold yourself back a little bit more can be the ticket.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And also learning the ways that anatomy and understanding of anatomy would influence sequencing in really important ways. And the sequencing is lacking. Our understanding of sequencing in the yoga world from an anatomical perspective is really a gap, I think. And once we can learn a little bit more about what's a good recipe in terms of sequencing to spit the body out on the other end of class feeling awesome, then our sequences will feel better for people's body. But we often approach sequencing from a choreographic standpoint. It's like, how can we choreograph this beautiful, very creative thing, instead of how can we sequence in a way that leaves the body feeling good and limits the ill effects of the movements. So that's an area that I have a lot of interest in training yoga teachers, as to those basic principles of sequencing. And the biggest one that I see missing is symmetry. So if I just throw in symmetry, we love to do very asymmetrical sequences in yoga, with all these long, like a bunch of postures over on one side and then like all of them on the other side. And that's a really asymmetrical sequence. And if we could just pop in symmetrical poses along the way, the body would love that. So that's an example of the way that we could think about sequencing from a more anatomical standpoint. Yeah. Yeah,
I like that. I often think too about warming up the parts of the body that we're going to be going deeper into. And I've definitely had experiences in yoga classes where it's like, now we're going into this really deep hip opener and we haven't woken up the hips.
Exactly. So that preparation is huge in sequencing, the concept of preparation and getting the joints moving even before you load them, especially the shoulders, right? Like non-weight bearing to weight bearing progression, even that, and then to more extreme positions with weight bearing. So yes, preparation is really important, and then compensation is really important.
Yeah.
On the other end.
Awesome. I remember a story you told in one of the trainings I did with you about, I guess it was when you were at Jessica Char's place and you saw teachers there giving people yoga prescriptions.
Yep.
Will you talk about that?
Yeah. So that was really exciting for me. And actually, that's one of the things that got me excited to do what I do now. That planted this big seed. It's like, oh, this is what I want to do. So basically, the center there was a yoga therapy center, and they would have clients come and meet with a yoga therapist, and they would have an assessment, and then they would get a prescription for a yoga practice. So here's your medicine. Go home and practice this. Come back in 2 weeks and tell me how it's going. Basically that kind of thing. And I did that when I was there. I met with a teacher and she worked with me and gave me a prescription for my practice. I could probably dig it up somewhere. It's 12 years ago, but probably would still be good for me. And it was really cool to watch that process. And that got me excited, and holding that in my mind, it was part of what kind of got me through the hoops of going to PT school, which is quite intense. And then practicing in a traditional setting for some years, and, getting to eventually where I am now, which is, that's kind of what I do. I see it as someone who comes to see me and I assess them, really a physical therapy assessment. But the movement part of what I do is always a yoga prescription, and I'll just write it out for them and say, go home and practice this every day, come back in 2 weeks, and they're short practices. So a therapeutic yoga sequence is not an hour long generally. I mean, I usually go for 20 minutes, something that's doable for people. So they'll do it. And it's like easy, Yeah. So that was really, really cool. And it inspired me a great deal.
Yeah. I always have remembered that. I mean, it must have been a long time ago that I heard you tell that story. And I was I love that.
Remember that.
Yeah. And just thinking about like movement medicine and the difference between what yoga is versus exercise, right? Like just like getting your cardio in or whatever, which is also important, but having yoga be the place where it's this more like inward attunement that is very different from other physical exertion or practices we might do in our lives.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yoga, in some ways, I think this might be like the ultimate example of cultural appropriation is just fitness yoga.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. Yoga is not a fitness program. It has actually nothing to do with fitness. It has to do with mental fitness. And it cares about the body insofar far as the body is where you live. The whole person lives here. And it's not just that it's separate from the rest of our parts. It is where the rest of us get expressed. It's through this body, this embodied consciousness. This body is the shape of the mind. It's the shape of the heart. It's the shape of all of it, so it does matter a lot, but it's not the end goal of yoga practice. The end goal of yoga practice is much, more subtle than the body.
Yeah.
It's about consciousness and I think about action, actually, about ethics.
Yeah, that's deepened a lot more for me as I've studied Ayurveda too.
Right.
And really thinking about, body, mind, and spirit, like all of it. And like, how are we feeding ourselves? What is our daily routine? And how are we, creating movement medicine through asana, but also not forgetting that there's other limbs, right?
Well, yes. And that what we're doing with the movement is we're nourishing this whole person. It's not about getting postures correctly according to some externalized form.
You don't get an award.
We don't get an award. I know. And it turns out that if we get the split, we're not a nicer person either.
Right.
I mean, I wish that it was that easy to like be a really good person. If all you had to do was get a posture right, oh my goodness, we probably have a really different world. But the practice is a means to go inward. It's a pathway inward, and we would like a practice that doesn't injure us along the way. That's important. But, I mean, from your perspective as an Ayurveda person, I think the elemental qualities of practice are so important.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of piece of Ayurveda that always stays with me is these elemental qualities that I really like to build into my asana practice, and actually is a big reason that I fell in love with this style of practice, because I'll see what you think about my analogy.
Okay.
The Vinyasa style of movement is very slow, but it's moving. Okay, so the slowness feels like earth, but the movement feels like water. And for me to pacify all my stuff, I need earth and water. And so I've just named that mud as an element. How's that work?
Great.
Yeah, it's very muddy, and I love mud. It's perfect for me.
Yeah. And that's kapha, is earth and water. Yeah. So it's very grounding and supportive and nourishing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Do you have any tips you want to share with all of us that are practicing yoga here, of like, what would you say to a big group of people practicing yoga online?
Keep practicing yoga with Hannah online.
Yay.
That's my tip. And, when, especially in the online world, you can't ask your teacher, they can't look at you directly and, work things out, have a private session or a little check-in to go over it maybe. And also start to turn your attention more inward. And really, when you look into the body, I think it's helpful if we just start to befriend this structure and sort of look at the body and say, hey, I'm totally safe here. I'm safe in this body, and this body knows how to move. It's made for movement, and I can be gentle with it, and I can use it like as an experimental place. I can just explore movement, and I will learn through my movement practice what my body likes. And I don't need to rely on what someone else tells me it's supposed to like.
Right.
That's where we get caught up in yoga land so much. So-and-so said this style of yoga was like therapeutic, or whatever, that this pose was supposed to like help my hips, And the thing is that yoga doesn't work like a formula. That's just not how it works. And a certain style or approach to asana isn't right for everyone.
Right.
Of course it's not. We're so different, So what works for one person isn't supposed to work for everybody. But there are a lot of messages coming from externally that that lead us to believe, well, this is supposed to feel good, so I'm just going to keep doing it until it feels good. 10 years later, I still have back pain.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's because I wasn't listening to my own body. It's been telling me for 10 years, it actually didn't like that. But this other person who I believe told me it's supposed to like it. So do you know what I mean? It's like we get so externally oriented. So feel free to turn inward and start to gather clues from your own experience. Your body will tell you what it likes, and it will tell you clearly. That's the thing, right? When you're in pain, it's obvious. And here's the other thing. When you feel better, it's obvious. You don't, if someone asks you, oh, how's your back feeling? Is it any better? And if you're like, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe that means no, it's not. Right. So we need to be able to trust that information. It's not ambiguous usually from the body.
Yeah. Awesome. So somebody just asked, do you do virtual consults for PT or yoga issues, shoulder impingement for one?
Totally. I do that a lot. I'm only seeing a few people in person. I'm mostly seeing people online. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't we use this as a segue at the end of our interview here for you to tell us where people can find you and what you have to offer?
Yeah. So you can find me on my website, which is just myname.com. It's libbyhinsley.com, not actually myname.com, but libbyhinsley.com. And you can get in touch with me that way. There's also, I'm on Instagram, and it's Libby Hinsley PT on Instagram. And then I have a new project that I'd love to tell you about, which is called Anatomy Bites. And I think you mentioned it already. It's a monthly membership for yoga teachers that will give you bite-sized chunks of anatomy each month to a little short lectures and then some short practices to embody the material, and then a live Q&A with me discussion, just a community discussion on the topic for the month. And then you get another chunk the next month. So basically the idea is yoga teachers who want to build a better foundation in anatomy, get more confident, regardless of their teaching style, just the background knowledge of anatomy. This is going to be topics that are very relevant to teaching yoga. So, and not overwhelming, and also fun. Yeah. So anyway, that's Anatomy Bites, and you can go to anatomybites.com. It's just a little landing page, but what you do is you put your email in, and then you'll be the first to know when it opens. So it just gets you on the email list, you know, and then I'm going to do a free webinar next month sometime on something, probably sequencing or cueing. So some of the things we've kind of touched on today, I'm going to do a whole webinar on that people can do for free. But anyway, so that's coming up, and I'm real excited about that. I hope you'll check it out.
Yeah, we have a fair amount of yoga teachers in this group, actually, so they might be jumping on that. And I can vouch for Libby being an amazing teacher. She's really fabulous. So she's really great to learn from. And maybe I'll jump in there too.
Oh, I hope you will.
Fun. Well, thank you.
No obligation to stay.
But you get to learn a lot. That's good.
Yeah.
I like learning. Well, thank you so much for being willing to come on here today, Libby. It's wonderful to connect with you and get to hear what you have to say about all of this. And it's also really reaffirming for what we're doing here in this group. So
yeah, thanks for having me. I think your group seems amazing, and keep it up. It's really fun to catch up with you too.
Yeah, great. Well, take care, everyone. Feel free to post more questions below if you're watching the replay, and we'll get back to you. And thanks for those of you that were live. We'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Bye.